Jester, level 7 upgrade. Today I'm going to be shimming the diffs for my mini E-Revo. I'll be using Team Associated Shim set. The measurements are 0.324 times 0.409 times 0.005. The part number is 21141. And this is easily the most recommended thing to do for all the Traxxas 1/16 models. It's a long process, but believe me guys, it will save you a lot of money in the long run. So without further delay, let's do it. I'm going to go ahead and start with the front diff. So the first thing I need to do is take off the front body mount, which is held in with 3 screws. There's 1, 2, and 3. Alright, with the screws removed, I can just slide that out, set that to the side, flip it over, and I'm going to have to take off the front skid plate, which is held in with 5 screws. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Alright, the front skid plate pops right off. And I have to be careful because these little bars can slide out, and they're what's holding the A-arms in. So now I'm going to move on to the servo saver, and I can undo either one of these screws. I don't have to undo both of them, just one of them. And this will prevent me from having to realign the servo. Now it's time to flip the RC back over, and I need to remove the 2 screws that hold in the top of the shocks. And once I pull out the screws, the top shock brace is going to come off. That is not a problem. Next, I'm going to go ahead and flip the shocks over, and I need to remove these 2 screws. And now you can finally pull the front diff housing away from the chassis. You'll see there's this little lip right here. Just make sure you lift that up, jiggle it around, it should slide right on out. There would be the diff gear. Now in order to get to the diff gear, we're going to have to split this thing in half. To do that, we're going to have to remove this front aluminum plate. This is only held in with 1 screw. Once you remove the aluminum front plate, you're going to want to take out this pin right here. And you're probably going to need some needle nose pliers. Pull that out, set that to the side. Then we're going to turn to the side of the diff housing, and you'll see there's a screw right there. We need to go ahead and remove that screw. Pull that out, set that aside. Now I'm going to look at the diff gear. The side that the teeth is on, I'm going to be removing that drive shaft. And it's only held in with 1 grub screw, right there. Once you remove that grub screw, the diff housing can now be pulled apart. Just go ahead and jiggle it very slightly. And yes, these little bars, like I mentioned, can fall out. You can easily just slide them in. But there is finally the diff gear. Now what's going to happen is that, as you can see, the diff gear touches the pinion gear right there. Now what happens when your diff gear strips is that if there's any space in between the diff and the pinion gear, these teeth could hop, and over time it will grind down the teeth onto diff gear or the pinion gear, and then you have to replace it. What a shim does is that it pushes the diff gear further into the pinion gear to prevent that from happening. So let's go ahead and install the shims. So here you can see I have the shim, which is literally just a really flat washer. I'm just going to slide it right on to the end of the diff gear, just like that. Now this is where it becomes a bit of a pain, because at this point you need to go ahead and put the whole housing back together. See if the gears work alright without it grinding too much. If it does, good. If it's still a little bit loose, add another one. Keep adding it until it's just too tight, and then once you make it too tight, remove 1 shim and you're good to go. I, for the fact, know that I only need 1 for now. Probably will have to go back at some state and install another one, but for now 1 is more than enough, at least for the front. So to reinstall this, there's a couple things that need to happen. First of all, make sure that this end of the diff gear goes right through that hole. On the top, you're going to want to make sure that the arm that the servo saver rests on goes right back into that position. Then you can just go ahead and slide it all back and you're good to go. Now I need to go ahead and reinstall the drive shaft to the end of the diff gear. Next, I can reinstall the screw that holds the 2 diff housing halves together, which goes in right there. Now because of that screw being tightened down all the way, you can see that the bottom diff housing is being pulled apart. So I just lay it on its side and push it down. That way you get enough leverage to go ahead and slide this back on. Once this is back on, it's time to go ahead and reinstall the screw that holds it on. And now it's time for easily the most difficult part doing this whole thing, and that is sliding that drive shaft into this one. Now you can see that there is a line that goes across. You can go ahead and make sure that it's vertical or horizontal. Then on this one you want to make sure that that line is vertical or horizontal. Then once it's all lined up, you're going to slide this part of the chassis between the rockers and then flip it over and do your best to go ahead and make sure that those drive shafts slide back together. This isn't easy. It's going to take a little bit of messing around with, but once you're done with that, believe me guys, it's literally the hardest part of this whole thing. Once it slides in all the way, and make sure that that servo arm does not get stuck inside of here, flip it back around and reinstall these two screws. Once those are back in place, you're going to flip the RC back over and reattach the servo arm back to the servo saver. After that's taken care of, you're going to move on to the front skid plate. Now make sure that all four of the bars are pushed in all the way. Then you're going to get your skid plate and slide it right on. You might have to push the two diff housings together in order to make it fit all the way. Then just reattach the 5 screws. Then you can flip the RC back over again, straighten out the shocks, get the top shock brace, make sure that the 2 pegs on the bottom of it go into the 2 holes found on the chassis. Then you just go ahead and screw it all back together. And finally, the last thing you have to do for the front is reinstall the front body mount. The 2 pegs that are found right here slide into those 2 slots, just like that. And then you can go ahead and reattach the 3 screws that go on top. And the front is done. Halfway there, guys. The rear is almost identical to the front. There's just a couple of small differences. So to start off, I'm going to be removing these 2 screws along with the 3 that are found on top. With all 5 of those screws removed, the body mount slides out backwards. Now, the 2 screws that go right here do hold the tie rod, so you're going to have to deal with these floating around. Next step is to remove the top 2 screws that hold in the shocks. Just like with the front, when you remove the screws, the shock brace is going to come out. Now, also like the front, you're going to move the shocks to the back and remove these 2 screws. Now I get to flip the RC over yet again and remove the rear skid plate, which is held in with only 4 screws. Once that is out of the way, you're going to move to the middle skid plate and remove these 2 screws. Now that those are taken care of, you're going to flip the RC back over, lift up this little lip on the chassis and pull it apart. Now unlike the front, there's these 2 little bumps which make it kind of hard to pull past the rockers. So with the rear you are going to have to use a little bit more force. Just like that. And like the front, you're going to have to slide that side of the shaft into this one, which is a little bit more of a pain. Honestly, I think the front is harder for some reason. But yeah, you're just going to line those up like before. But anyways, for the rear aluminum plate, it's not held in with a screw, so you're just going to slide that right on off. Then you're going to turn to the side, and you'll see that the screw is not in the way of the arm, so you're just going to go ahead and take that on out. Pull that out, set it to the side, and now we're going to look at the diff gear. Just like with the front, the side that the teeth are on, you're going to be removing that corresponding drive shaft, which would be this side, and it is also just held in with a single grub screw. Now once that grub screw is taken out, you can easily just pull the diff housing apart. Ooh, the bearing came out. That's no problem. Just go ahead and slide that off the diff and push it back into the housing. Now there is no turnbuckles holding it together, so it's a bit easier to work on the back. Now just like with the front, I'm going to go ahead and figure out how many shims it takes for me to put this in there without it being too tight, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, so after messing around with it for a little bit, I found out that I do need 2 shims. So I went ahead and slid those on there. And now the housing can easily just go back together. Go ahead and reattach the drive shaft and reinsert that screw that holds the housing together. Now that that's taken care of, I can go ahead and push these 2 halves together, slide on the aluminum plate, and then reattach this back to the chassis, which is always easier said than done. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and reattach these 2 screws as well as the 2 screws that go on the middle skid plate. Now that those 4 screws have been reinstalled, it's time to move on to the rear skid plate. Make sure that all 4 of those little bars are pushed in all the way, and then just slide on the rear skid plate and then reattach those 4 screws. Then you can flip the RC back on over and reinstall the top shock brace for the shocks. And just remember, just like with the front, make sure those little pegs go into the holes in the chassis. And now for the final step. Go ahead and slide the tie rods back into place. Make sure they stay that way. Turn the RC to the side and you'll see there's this flat piece that sticks out. Make sure it slides underneath the chassis but above the diff housing, and then reattach the 2 screws in the back and the 3 on top. And we are done. I know it was a lot of steps and some of those steps were a pain in the ass, but guys, believe me, this is going to save me a lot of money in the long run. If I strip one of those diff gears, it's about $10 to $20 to replace it. And as I mentioned before, this works with all the Traxxas 1/16 scale models, including the Slash, the Summit, the Rally, as well as the E-Revo. But I won't lie, guys, it does feel good to have that done. And that was a level 7 upgrade for Jester.